Hello, I'm Darren Bowyer, Director of the Gurkha Museum. This lecture, first given in person at the museum in June 2021, is now presented as part of our online series Karma Sunu, Nepali for To Listen at Home. This series is presented free of charge, but if you are able to support us, then do please consider making a donation, which will help us to continue and grow our work of telling the inspiring story of Gurkha service to Britain. Our speaker is Lieutenant General Sir Barney White-Spunner. General Barney was commissioned into the Blues and Royals. He commanded the Household Cavalry Regiment, including a deployment to Bosnia, and was Deputy Director of Defence Policy in the Ministry of Defence. He later commanded 16 Air Assault Brigade and the Kabul Multinational Brigade. As GOC 3rd United Kingdom Division, he deployed elements of that division to Iraq as the core of Multinational Division South East. His final appointment was Commander of the Field Army. General Barney was appointed CBE in 2002 and KCB in the 2011 Birthday Honours List. After retiring from the British Army in December of 2011, he became Executive Chairman of the Countryside Alliance and Director of the Countryside Alliance Foundation. He subsequently became a Director of Burstock Limited and was appointed Chairman of the Advisory Board of UK Fisheries in October 2018. He has written a number of highly regarded books on hunting and the countryside and on military history. But he is talking here about his acclaimed 2017 book, Partition, the story of Indian independence and the creation of Pakistan. The story we're now going to hear is highly relevant to the Gurkha story, as one of the consequences of Indian independence was, of course, at the end of the British Indian Army. In 1947, the British Indian Army had 10 regiments of Gurkhas, each of 2 battalions. 6 of those regiments, the 1st, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 8th and 9th, became part of the Indian Army, in which they still serve today in vastly increased numbers. While the 2nd, 6th, 7th and 10th became part of the British Army, moving initially to Malaya and Singapore, subsequently to Hong Kong and then to the UK, where they would eventually be amalgamated in today's Royal Gurkha Rifles. General Barney's career has seen him serve alongside and command formations including Gurkha soldiers, and he headed the team that planned the post-earthquake relief in Nepal, so he knows Gurkhas well.
My name is Barney White-Spunner, and I've written a book called Partition, which is the story of Indian independence and the creation of Pakistan in 1947. And it's a great pleasure to talk to you about that book today, for 2 reasons. I mean, the first is because this talk is in aid of the Gurkha Museum, and no British soldier worth their salt will turn down an opportunity to help the Gurkhas. And secondly, of course, no author will turn down an opportunity to promote that book. But also this year, 2022, is the 75th anniversary of Indian independence, of the creation of Pakistan, and of the really very sad events that marked those events 75 years ago today. I wrote Partition because I found myself in Iraq in 2008. I found myself in a very difficult position in Basra, where the operation had stagnated, and we had a British military who really were ineffective sitting at Basra airport. And you cannot in Iraq escape the legacy of India or the Indian Army. India, as you may know, was actually run by the government of India rather than from London when it was part of a British zone of influence. And the impact, the influence, if you like, of India and the Indian Army is all around you. And I looked at what was going on in Iraq, and to be honest, what a muddle it had become by 2008. And I thought back to 1947. I'd spent quite a lot of my life in India. And the Iraqis would say, well, of course, you're grandparents wouldn't have done this, they wouldn't have done that, they would have done this, that, or the other. But I just began to wonder why, if the Raj had been so competent, so fantastic, if the Indian Army had been so efficient, why had 1947, which I've always had a great interest, been really quite such a disaster? And we have to be honest, as you will hear, I'm afraid, in what can be quite harrowing parts of his talk, it was a disaster. And it led me to think that actually as a nation we have a habit of missing those points in history when we should finish something we should leave, and which by doing so we would have benefited both ourselves and the people who we were trying to help. And we have a curious habit of acting against our own self-interest. It also upsets me that we don't teach enough about the history of India, history of Pakistan, of Bangladesh, which of course are all parts of the same whole, in our schools. Our children learn lots about the US civil rights movement, and that is important and worthwhile, but surely not at the expense of learning about our own story in India, actually what went on in India, of how Pakistan and Bangladesh came about. And if you look at the South Asian population in this country, if you look at those British people who have South Asian origin, you will find that the events of 1947 have had a very, very strong influence on them, in an awful lot of cases directly as families. So, to the book. What I've done in this book is I've structured it month by month. I wanted to look at both what was happening nationally and also look at personal recollection. Now, I know that an awful lot of the audience for this talk will be people who know quite a lot about the background to India. An awful lot of you will have links to the Gurkhas, so you will understand a lot of the background to what I'm saying. So what I'm going to do, rather than take us slavishly through and sort of, if you like, Janet and John story of Indian independence, I'm going to make a series of points which I think tell the story rather better. And some of these you'll agree with, some you may not. And I'll talk for about 40 minutes. Before I do so, let's just first remind you of the facts. India in 1947 was the second largest country in the world by population, 400 million people. 300 million people, of their 300 million, of those 400 million, lived in 11 provinces under British rule. Originally, the British India had started with the 3 provinces of Calcutta, Bombay, now Mumbai, and Madras, now Chennai, under the East India Company. From 1857, after what was then called the Indian Mutiny and is now called by many the First War of Independence, they'd been ruled by the Crown through a viceroy, and a British Indian civil service. However, a third of the territory and a quarter of the population remained under their hereditary rulers, 562 of them. Some no bigger than larger states, some like Mysore, Kashmir, Hyderabad, a population of 60 million, and the size of Italy, almost sort of mini countries in their own right. And of course Travancore, which we'll talk more about, down in the south of India. 3/4 of the population of India, and again, just to remind you, we're talking about what was then India, were Hindu, with a sizable Sikh minority, most of whom lived in the Punjab. 1/4 of the population was Muslim. The Muslim population were all over India, but they were concentrated mostly, again, in the Punjab in the northwest, and in Bengal to the east. The Punjab itself, which we'll again be talking about a lot, that was a key part of India. It was the breadbasket of India. It's the place which, the province which produced an awful lot of India's corn. And also it was one of the most important military recruiting areas. So the issue in 1947 was not so much should India become independent. That had been variously promised since 1918. The issue in 1947 had come down to be how to satisfy both Hindu and Muslim demands, which were conflicting. So if we look first of all at the Hindu and the Sikh side of life. And although the Sikhs obviously is a very distinct and different religion, in terms of political interest, they tend to be identified in 1947 with the Hindus. And they were represented by the Congress Party. The Congress Party was led by Mahatma Gandhi, the great Gandhi, as you can see there in the photograph in his traditional dress or undress, and Nehru, who you see him talking to. And Congress said that they represented all India. And that is important. Nehru particularly, who had spent some of his early life in Russia and saw things much more in economic and social terms than religious. His insistence always was that Congress represented all Indians, regardless of religion. And Congress had led Home Rule agitation since 1918. In the 1920s, the Muslims had gone along with them. But by the 1930s, the All India Muslim League was agitating for its own state, fearing a future non-British India would be swallowed up by the Hindus. Gandhi had made a name for himself. He was a huge international figure, arguably one of the best known people in the world, certainly the best known in India by the 1930s. Here he is on his famous Salt March, when he proclaimed that he would no longer pay salt tax and urged the other Indians not to pay the salt tax, which he said was a grossly unfair way of the British government raising revenue. And the other man who becomes critical of this story is Patel, Vallabhbhai Patel, who is sort of known as the hard man of Congress. And it is Patel, particularly, and Nehru, who really start to control Congress and to dominate Congress in the events to come. But opposing Congress, we have the All India Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who becomes the founding father of Pakistan. A London-educated lawyer. Interestingly, all the key people in this were actually Nehru, Gandhi, and Jinnah, all London-educated lawyers. Jinnah is not particularly a strongly religious Muslim. He is obviously Muslim. He is really interested more in the representation of the Muslim population politically. By 1947, there wasn't a clear idea of what Pakistan was going to be. The idea of Pakistan had actually been originally mooted in Lahore, in the famous Lahore Resolution of March 1940. Its name coming from the letters of the main, like Muslim areas of India: Punjab, Afghanistan, Kashmir, Sindh, and Stan, which is the traditional suffix for states in Central Asia. But the concept of Pakistan developed, but it was not at all clear what it should be. So we have this idea, espoused by Jinnah, of the All Indian Muslim League, of an entity, but it's not geographically expressed. So we're not going into 1947 with an idea saying that actually what is now Pakistan would definitely be a separate state. The Jinnah's idea was that the All India Muslim League spoke for all Muslims, much the same way as Congress said they spoke for all Indians. And of course, because the Muslim population was scattered around India, people would argue, as you can see in this witty and actually very accurate cartoon, that actually his ambition was to have all India in Pakistan. And this is actually, in a way, true, because what really influenced Jinnah, I think, was the idea of what had happened in Palestine. Jinnah's idea was that he would share power representing the Muslims in a federated India. And his concept of Pakistan at the beginning of 1947, it will obviously change as we go through the year, was much more based on the original British Palestine White Paper, which saw two communities, in that case Arabs and Israelis, in this case obviously Hindus and Muslims, sharing power in a unified state, something which, as we will come to in a moment, obviously Congress was not happy with. The Britain had been looking very seriously at Indian independence in the 1930s. We have the 1935 India Act, which had set the conditions for independence. And of course, there were those in India who'd argued it was coming far, far too late. And the independence movement had been gaining not only in popularity, but also in effectiveness and in violence during the 1930s. Other British colonies, Canada, Australia, had been given independence. And India's performance in World War II had been really quite exceptional. Congress itself was like anti the war effort. Most of the Congress leaders actually were jailed during the war. And there had been the non-cooperation movement, which had gathered strength. But actually, if you look at what India contributed to the war effort and the defeat of Japan with the 14th Army, it was quite extraordinary. And again, it just sort of reinforced the view that it was really quite unreasonable for independence not to come as soon as possible. Jinnah used the opportunity of the Second World War to get closer and closer to the British government and used it to extract promises that Muslim interests would be properly taken into account when the settlement actually came. And that actually then comes through this man, through Clement Attlee, British Labour Prime Minister, elected in July 1945, surprisingly, defeating Churchill. Nobody more surprised than Churchill by that. But important in that it had been Churchill, who is unfairly vilified in many ways in India. But it actually was against independence. But it is Attlee and his Labour government who, in August 1945, give a commitment that the British will leave India at the latest by June 1948. Now, a great statement and badly needed, but it of course means that 1947 then becomes a terrible year for India, because during that year everything has to come to a head. It ends up with the partition of India into West and East Pakistan, which involves the partition of Punjab and Bengal, those two areas I said just now, which actually had the largest Muslim concentrations. We end up with a million people dead, a million people. And we end up with about 10 million refugees, many of whom will end up in the British Isles, United Kingdom, as Hindu and Muslim hatred sort of spills over. It's a complicated and difficult story, so I'm now going to take parts of it and concentrate on them, and I hope by doing so I will paint a picture of the whole. I think it's important to realise that India was in a far more serious condition in 1947 than the government in London was realised internationally. The Raj, which we all sort of associate, I think, with British India, the splendour, the possessions, the jewels, the uniforms, the Raj was well and truly finished. There are good and bad parts about the Raj. It's not my job this morning to go in to be an apologist for empire or to be a great proponent of its dismantling. But what was absolutely true was that it was really not fit for purpose after World War II. The urgency to find a solution, which seemed to pass Westminster by, was becoming more and more urgent actually in India itself, where the government really was beginning to fall down. So if we listen to later Lord Ismay, to Bruce Ismay, when he arrives, there was an urgency to find a solution which seemed to have passed Westminster by. And Mountbatten and Ismay, who had been Churchill's military secretary during the war, who now came out to accompany Mountbatten in Delhi, were absolutely horrified when they arrived at just how bad things had become. Ismay wrote that before I arrived in Delhi, I had thought that a period of 15 months was far too short a time in which to complete arrangements for the transfer of power, so i.e. between arriving in February 1947 and June 1948. But he had not been there 3 short weeks before he concluded, far from being too short, it was far too long. And he was somebody who knew India very well, was absolutely horrified by the animosity and the hatred that had emerged between Hindu and Muslim. This had really started to take sort of practical effect in August 1946 in a dreadful series of events which have become known since as the Great Calcutta Killings, which left 5,000 people dead and 10,000 people injured. And it showed a level of intercommunal violence which had previously been under the surface but hadn't really come to the surface before. And it was really truly shocking, both for the people of Calcutta and obviously and as a wake-up call to people for just what could happen in India if a solution to this Hindu-Muslim antagonism was not found. Hindu on Muslim and Muslim on Hindu, and really causing a really frightening level of mob violence. In East Bengal, then in October 1946, there had been a series of raids and murders, mostly Muslim on Hindu, in the area in the South Bengal, in Chittagong, in Tipara and Noakhali. In Bihar, in October 1946, 8,000 Muslims were massacred at the Garmuksha fair in that November. And that was, if you like, the sort of the tip of the iceberg of a whole series of killing. So there was hardly a day during the winter of 1946-1947 without murders across northern India. Then in March 1947, at least 5,000 people and 3,000 were killed and 3,000 seriously injured, mostly Sikhs and Hindus, when Muslims in Rawalpindi, in the Punjab, went on the rampage. There was the violence by the winter was getting nearer to Delhi. This is a slide of two little Miao boys from the Miao tribe, a Muslim tribe that lived just outside Delhi. Interestingly, this photograph was taken just where the Delhi International Airport now is. But what was really frightening is that the Raj was not functioning. The British government, was not able to control this violence. And arguably it hadn't really been functioning properly since 1939. And I just want to look back now at one event, which I think shows this in graphic detail and shows just how, if you like, Britain had stayed too long. And that's the Bengal Famine. Between 1942 and 1944, there was terrible famine in Bengal. This famine left 3 million people dead. Now, just put 3 million people in the Second War into perspective. The total Commonwealth Empire, call it what you will, casualties in World War II are about 500,000, if you take everybody, blitz, military, the lot. So this is 6 times as many British subjects who die, killed during the war from famine. And what was really terrible about this is it wasn't caused by a shortage of food, but by failure in distribution and pricing. People died because they couldn't afford the food that was available. The price of rice more than doubled in 1942, from 6 rupees per maund, a maund is about £82, to 14. By August 1943 it had reached 37 rupees, so a 6-fold increase in 18 months. But food supplies actually in Bengal were 11% higher in mid-1943 than they had been in January 1942. A lot has been made of Churchill's refusal to allocate shipping and grain to Bengal as being the cause of this. But actually it's a bit of a red herring and actually symptomatic of a sort of Indian dislike of Churchill. The problem, as Sir Frederick Burrows, the governor in Bengal, said, is that there was, during the famine, an almost complete breakdown of the administrative machine. And that was the result of which was these 3 million casualties. Sorted out eventually by this man, the great Wavell, who became viceroy during the war. It was Wavell who, taking troops from the preparation for the defeat of the Japanese in Burma, but actually sorted the famine out. He went to Bengal, his first visit as viceroy in October 1943, and he wrote that he'd seen a destitute woman and several destitute children in a bazaar near Kontai, that's near Calcutta. The children were sucking water out of a bucket in which an old gur bag had been placed. A mental demoralisation took control of the victims. Children, reduced to skin and bone, had got in the habit of feeding like dogs. You tried to give them a decent meal, but they would break away and start wandering about and eat filth. By October, any form of mutual respect had vanished. The villagers are themselves getting callous about it. And one village head was Wavell quoted as saying about those dying, "What does it matter? They are the useless ones." So how did this happen? How did the Raj got to this state? Well, the war, obviously. But even before the war, the Indian civil service had been badly under-recruited. By January 1947, Sir John Colville, who was a governor in Mumbai, had lost 70% of his Indian civil service officers and 90% of his police. He had 22 Indian civil service people to run a population of 30 million. Now, the Raj had always been proud of the fact that he ran this huge country with a very small number of people, but that, if you like, is reductum ad absurdum. And of course, the result was poor administration. The Raj had also proved unable to modernise its government. The 1930s budgets, roughly 26%, a quarter, was going to the military. That's roughly equivalent to what the Soviet Union was devoting to the Soviet forces before 1989. 14% on the railways, 1% on health, and 6% on education, rather less than was being spent on pensions and salaries. The revenue from income tax was only 7%. In the UK it was 45%. So the revenue from, if you like, direct taxation linked to ability to pay was 7%. UK 45%, and most taxes were indirect, like the salt tax, which Gandhi objected to so strongly, and I showed you a slide of at the beginning. The land tax, which was an arbitrary tax on people's land holdings in a peasant community, brought in 15%, and customs 23%. So Delhi and the Indian civil service were unable to develop India economically or commercially. And this much vaunted boast that the Brits ran India with less than 1,000 people was all very well, but really it wasn't adequate for modern bureaucracy. The other thing which is important to note is that the police were ineffective by 1947. Actually, there is an argument that the British-run police force in India was never that effective anyway. But by 1947 it was completely incapable, certainly in Calcutta and Bihar, and especially in the Punjab, where it would have been most useful, where it was seen to be very biased towards the Muslims and was in fact indeed a Muslim-based force. The one thing that was left working, and we'll come back to this in 1947, was the army. 500,000 in the Indian army, so these are Indians organised into Indian regiments and formations, and then a further 100,000 British and Gurkha troops. Gurkhas come from Nepal, as you know. I don't need to say that probably to this audience, rather than India. So these are like British soldiers who were stationed there. The Indian army was regrouped after 1945 and was an efficient functioning machine. It was a much mightier machine, like than maybe we're used to associating with armies now. It had its own factories, farms, huge logistic effort. And it also was accompanied by a very effective Indian Air Force and Indian Navy. There were also state armies. You remember it would be the Maharaja's armies, some of which were effective, some were slightly more what I would call sort of chocolate box soldiers. And we had it was all commanded by this man on the right, Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck, who, rather like Wavell, had been sacked by Churchill in North Africa. But a man who knew India really well. He'd served in the Indian Army all his life, spoke several Indian languages, and was hugely loved and respected by the soldiers he commanded. So you have got this one really effective, powerful force. It's about the only thing that 1947 is working. So that, if you like, is a snapshot of where we are with the British administration, we are with the country as a whole. But the second point I then want to make is that Congress, who saw themselves obviously as the natural heirs to the government of India, realised that India was slipping out of control. They realised that the government was falling to pieces. They realised that the intercommunal violence was getting to a level that it was unsustainable, and there was a real danger of the country fragmenting. First of all, Congress were longing for the Brits to go. That the Brits were still there in 1947 seems like something of a bad dream. The Congress leaders were quite old. Gandhi was 78, Patel 72, and Nehru was 58. But actually Nehru had been very ill, he'd lost his wife, and they of course had spent quite a lot of their last 10 years in prison. They were being imprisoned at various stages by the Raj. And they'd spent their whole life working for something that they knew was inevitable but never seemed to actually happen. Secondly, they were getting increasingly alarmed. They were going to inherit a country they couldn't govern. They'd long appreciated that the Raj had exercised effective control over India by maintaining absolute authority over security, foreign and regional affairs and communications. And they weren't prepared to franchise those powers out to the regions, to the states and the provinces, which is actually what would have happened under Jinnah's idea, Jinnah's vision, if you like, of this federalised India over one country, but with the Muslims and the Hindus, if you like, the All India Muslim League and Congress sharing central power. They simply, Congress, and let's remember that Nehru actually was very influenced by the Soviet model, by the strength of the centre, by the need for strong central government. And they simply weren't prepared to go along with that. During the first half of 1947, Patel actually insists on much tougher central control over tax and finance, which would have effectively, again, made Jinnah's model unsustainable. And they saw sort of Jinnah's view of this federal India as tantamount to anarchy. And when it was actually embodied in one of the first independence plans that was put forward in the spring of 47, Nehru had a conniption fit and insisted that it was changed. They didn't like Jinnah. It goes right back to 1920s at the great Nagpur meeting of the Congress. It looked at one point actually as if Jinnah might then have been elected as leader of Congress rather than and Gandhi, but there'd been a breakdown in approach, and actually arguably Gandhi was always going to manipulate his way into control. They didn't like the fact Jinnah had, as they said, sort of toadied up to the Brits, toadied up to the Raj when they were in jail during the Second World War. But rather it was the experience of trying to work with him in a fledgling constituent assembly which was created through 1946 as a sort of prelude to independence that proved they couldn't work with him. And they thought that this federalised system was just never going to work. I think the final straw for Congress came in April 1947 with a plebiscite in the Northwest Frontier Province. Northwest Frontier Province is, as the name suggests, in northwest of what is now Pakistan. Bizarrely, you might think, it was a strongly Muslim area, but it had elected a provincial Congress government. And Nehru had convinced himself that actually this meant that his vision of Congress, his idea of Congress speaking for all Indians, was actually true, believed and adhered to by the population. This man, a great man called Olaf Carrow, who was the governor, the British governor, realised that actually those local assembly elections had been, if you like, a flash in the pan. They hadn't been taken very seriously. People hadn't quite realised what they meant. And he argued very strongly in April with Mountbatten that actually if there was going to be any division of India, then there had to be a plebiscite in the Northwest Frontier Province, because if it was put in with India, it would cause civil war. And he was proved to be absolutely right. Nehru never forgave him for it. Nehru went up to the area to see for himself, got attacked by this Pathan leader, and actually was quite lucky to get away with his life. And it did actually create deep mistrust. This Hindu-Muslim antipathy, particularly in that area, just needs a little bit more sort of unpacking. And let me just read you now a short extract, which I think really illustrates it. This is Bir Bahadur Singh, a Sikh from near Rawalpindi, writing about the way that his village, his community treated Muslims, which he thought was shaming. But it gives you a very good idea of really how deep this sort of Muslim-Hindu animosity went in the Northwest. He wrote that when we needed them, the Muslims, they were always there to help. Yet when they came to our houses, we treated them so badly. If a Muslim was coming along the road and we shook hands with him and we had, say, a box of food or something in our other hand, that food would then become soiled and we could not eat it. If we were holding a dog in one hand and food in the other, there's nothing wrong with that food. But how can it be that two people living in the same village and one treats the other with respect and the other doesn't even give him the consideration due to a dog? It is really with this in mind, with this idea that the British government's falling to bits, that India itself is fragmenting, that Jinnah's view of federalised India is not going to work, that Congress come to the conclusion that that partition, physical partition, so the interpretation of Pakistan as a separate country, or as two separate countries as it turns out, is going to happen. Again, there's myths about partition. People still believe it's Jinnah's vision. Of course, it wasn't. Partition was a decision taken by Congress. Jinnah did not want it. He again wanted to go back to that Palestine White Paper of 1939, where he wanted an independent state where two communities lived together. And if he had really wanted, arguably he couldn't say he was speaking for all India's Muslims when the partition actually leaves so many Muslims behind outside what would become Pakistan. There was no clear plan, as we know, of what Pakistan was going to be. It was being worked on by this man, Liaquat Ali, who was who become Jinnah's Prime Minister. But what happens after that decision to go for a plebiscite, to go for a reinterpretation, if you like, of the Northwest Frontier Province, is that Congress start working up their own plan for partition. At the same time, Mountbatten and the Raj government in Delhi are working up what's known as Plan Balkan, which was much more of a fragmented plan. It did see like a pepper pottering of areas of Muslim influence, but that was a complete anathema to Nehru, to Gandhi as well. Gandhi never wanted partition at all. He was very reluctant to accept it, but he realised, even Gandhi realised, that he was going to have to accept it. And when actually on the 3rd of June, when the decision is announced that there is going to be a partition of India, Jinnah still goes back after that meeting and argues that it's impossible, it won't work. He insists that if Britain does insist on partition, with Congress allows Congress to insist on it, British responsibilities will last way beyond 1940-48. They're going to have to stay and help Pakistan. And he also argues, which he knew would not be popular, but was inevitable, was that the army, that great Indian army, was going to have to be divided. Congress' attitude is interesting. Gandhi really took considerable persuasion to go for partition, but he did it really because he got rid of the Brits. It actually moved things forward. And neither he nor Patel, who is really the architect, along with a man called V.P. Menon, who we'll come to in a minute, they didn't think it would last. They thought it was a temporary move. Patel referred to the areas that would become Pakistan, particularly Karachi and Bengal, as a rural slum full of converted Hindus, which, very offensive as it is now, was actually very much his attitude. So what this is, what it is then, is a sort of means to get the Brits out, to get on, to create a government, to stop the country falling to bits, and to enable people to move forward. So that's where we get to. Now, who is going to implement this? Enter stage right, Lord Mountbatten, Admiral Mountbatten, who comes in as the last viceroy. He takes over from Wavell. And from 1947, his appointment was to deliver independence. His remit was to work with Congress and to work with Jinnah to deliver this independence. He got on very well with Gandhi. He immediately struck up a rapport with Gandhi. That slide's actually quite interesting because Lady Mountbatten had to go. The Viceroy's office, one of the few rooms in Delhi, was actually air conditioned. Because Gandhi never wore any clothes and temperature outside obviously was very hot, whenever he came in for an office call, she had to go and turn the air conditioning off, other than in case Gandhi got pneumonia, which would have been obviously rather terrible. So you have a very good relationship developing, which enables the whole process between Mountbatten and Gandhi and Nehru. Though actually, Mountbatten's power is very circumscribed. Mountbatten would later in life put about that he was sort of all powerful in this process. Actually, he wasn't. He was a ringmaster, and a very good ringmaster. He was a sort of master of ceremonies, if you like, and I think he's had an awful lot of criticism. I personally think he did it rather well. The trouble is, Mountbatten is that sort of in old age, he maybe ascribed to himself rather more authority, rather more the power than actually he had. The real power was being exercised through this man, through Stafford Cripps, who was president of the Board of Trade in London, working with Nehru, with whom he was very close, and with a man called Krishna Menon, who was the Congress representative in London. So, but whereas you've got that sort of really good working relationship now between the Brits, between Mountbatten, between Nehru and Gandhi, and between the cabinet in London, you have a much more difficult relationship here with Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. This is a very unfortunate photograph because Jinnah thought that when this is his taken on his first call on Mountbatten as Viceroy, he thought when he went to Viceroy's house in Delhi that Lady Mountbatten would be between him and the Viceroy. And but as it turned out, he was put in the middle, but he still came out, shows how nervous he was, with that well-known quip, "a rose between two thorns," which didn't actually necessarily endear him to the Mountbattens. And it was a very difficult relationship. So by June, we have this announcement of partition, Congress behind it, it being forced on Jinnah, and him having to go along with it and having to create, if you like, a new country. But what about the date? We're still officially dealing with June 1948, which is a date that Attlee had announced in Parliament in August 1945. But on the 3rd of June, it is announced that in fact, India will be independent and Pakistan will be created in the middle of August, 14th and 15th respectively. Now there is again symptomatic slightly of how Mountbatten saw events in old age. He would claim to have decided the date himself. He said it was based on VJ Day, victory in a victory over Japan Day from 1945. That is not true. The date, again, like everything now, is Congresses. It was Congress who insisted on the Brits getting out as soon as we now had a plan. Gandhi had actually written a note. It's actually in the archives. It's a fascinating note written on old envelopes in pencil, which is how Gandhi would typically correspond, urging Mountbatten the Brits should go by the end of June. So while you've got the announcement on the 3rd of June, actually they should be gone within sort of 3 weeks. And the reason they gave August is effectively it's the amount of time it takes to get the necessary legislation through the British Parliament. British Parliament sits in July, then breaks for its summer holidays at the end of July. And there had to be that constitutional backing for the plan, for the partition plan. And really the middle of August was as soon as after that they could realistically come up with the action necessary for partition itself. So now you have, in June, the great heat of June in Delhi, you've got a country that was already very ill at ease with itself, fragmenting without a proper administration, now facing the idea that it's going to be partitioned, that actually chunks of it are going to be cut off and made into a separate country, and it's going to be divided on religious grounds. And anathema to Jinnah, and anathema to Nehru, who still sees India in sort of socialist terms, and it doesn't really hold with its religious division. So how do you decide what's going to be divided off? Well, you first of all consult this man, VP Menon, who is one of, I think, to my mind, the greats of this whole process. He was Indian civil service, British Indian civil service officer, came from southern India, and actually he's really the brain behind so much of what happens in 47. A hugely principled, hard-working, decent man, Menon. And it's him actually who has influenced the plan that Congress put forward. He sort of worked as a bridge, if you like, between Patel and the British. But you also, he doesn't really have a huge amount of time for Jinnah later, but he and Jinnah had again been quite close. So he is actually able to bridge many gaps. And on the 3rd of June plan, and that is the group in the Viceroy's study, in Viceroy's house. On the 3rd of June, you can see Ismay sitting at the back. They sit around a tight round table because Mountbatten believed that sort of sense of physical intimacy would mean that they were going to come to a decision sort of more amicably. But you've still got to decide how you're going to partition this country. And that is where the Boundary Commission come in. Now this is a picture of the much maligned Boundary Commission, led by a London barrister called Radcliffe, who you can see sitting there in the middle in a white suit, and with representatives from Congress and from the All India Muslim League, who weren't actually particularly helpful to him because both took their decisions based almost entirely along sort of partisan grounds. The only other British face in that picture is a man called Christopher Beaumont, who's actually, due thanks to him, that we know quite a lot about the workings of the Boundary Commission. So the Boundary Commission are there to work out what is going to be Pakistan, what's going to be India, how they're going to divide what effectively going to be Punjab and Bengal into two bits. And you know, a hugely difficult job to do at any time. To do it in that very tight time frame, you know, arguably almost impossible. There is a sort of myth that that Radcliffe's commission sat in Purdan, they didn't see anybody, they were sort of shut away in Delhi and did the whole thing off maps. Again, completely untrue. It's one of those sort of myths that's come about. And that picture itself was taken in Simla, which shows that they went there. They travelled quite widely. Radcliffe himself said he never slept in Government House in Calcutta because he was haunted by Clive's ghost. It's also true, I'm afraid, that they were influenced. And it's absolutely true, as proved by Beaumont, that they changed some particular issues over the border in the Punjab around Firozpur and the Zera district. Firozpur particularly, which has been an issue ever since. They've also been accused of making fairly major changes over Gurdaspur, but there's less evidence for that. And it's probable that was always going to be given to India, although Pakistan would now claim that actually it should be it should be part of Pakistan. But this commission then sits between June and the middle of August, and it's tasked with coming up with boundaries. It's tasked with coming up with what's going to be the new countries. And this is actually what they come up with, and you can see those two red lines. They split off effectively what is West Punjab, and they join it together with Sindh, Northwest Frontier Province, and create the body we now know as Pakistan, what was then called West Pakistan, and they carve off the east of Bengal to make what is then East Pakistan, and we now know as Bangladesh. Now, not time this morning to go into huge amounts of details about how they worked. It's a fascinating process, very difficult in Punjab, much easier, funnily enough, in Bengal, not least because the administrative records in Bengal, the Brits have been there so long, but they had a much better feel for how the villages, how the communities were scattered and settled, unlike the Punjab, which had only come into British control in the middle of the 19th century. So we've got a partition coming up, we've got some boundaries, a commission working on it, we've got Jinnah and Liaquat Ali creating a government, we've got Congress longing to get on to govern India. And there is Mountbatten with his famous calendar, which he produced with the number of days left to independence to try and urge people on to get all the administrative machinery in place. But we haven't yet talked about these people, the Maharajas, who rule a third of the land and a quarter of the population. What about them? This is the view of a typical Maharaja, perhaps, rich in jewels and harems and tiger shoots, and perhaps less keen on administration. Again, like so much 1947, this is a fallacy. The reality of the Maharajas is that feudal lords, certainly, autocrats in many cases, but I would say the majority, and certainly a lot, are hugely responsible, dedicated rulers. And of course, they are of the same, they're not imposed like the Brits, they are of the same family, the same tribes, the same people, the same communities who they have authority over. Here we have Bhopal, who was he actually fell very out of sorts with the British there in his Air Force uniform. Many of them had served in the war. Sadly, we know Bhopal now more for their awful Union Carbide factory, but again, it was a sort of critical state. And this man, Jodhpur, Hanat Singh, one of the, say sadly, to be killed early in an air crash, but one of the great sort of visionary Maharajas. And if you look at when the famine was in Bengal under British rule, actually in Jodhpur, there is no famine at all, despite the fact it's a desert kingdom and it was actually going through the same problems. So, and this idea that actually the irresponsible rulers is simply, again, not true. Some are. Travancore is another example. Travancore is the size of population size of Australia. So the ruler of Travancore says to the Brits, not unreasonably, why have you given in Australia independence? Why can't Travancore now become an independent country? Travancore has the best primary education system in India. Again, far better than anything actually in the British provinces. So an arrangement needs to be made with them, and they are told that they must effectively accede to either India or Pakistan. It becomes almost it's sort of inevitable who will go where because of where they are geographically. And actually the vast majority go to India because the vast majority of princely states are in that block, and there's very few, really none in Bengal, a few small ones, and very few in Pakistan. Some of them were rogues, like this man, the Maharaja of Junagadh, who had an absolute obsession with dogs, and whose weddings for his dogs cost large parts of Junagadh state treasury, and he refused to take a decision, and actually eventually although he fled to Pakistan with his hereditary prime ministers, the Bhuttos, a family who we will hear more of in Pakistan in later history. His state actually is then annexed by India. But there were two others who would cause problems. The first, this man, Hari Singh, Maharaja of Kashmir, and it was his inability as a Hindu ruler of a Muslim majority state, and a critical state to both India and Pakistan as they would become. It was his indecision that has led to arguably the most damaging legacy of partition in 1947, the ongoing conflict in Kashmir. An ineffective man and weak man, as you can see from that photograph. And the other, the Nizam of Hyderabad, the richest man in the world, who, again, a Muslim one ruling a predominantly Hindu state. Eventually his state would be taken over by India. It was almost inevitable. He argued he should be independent, a bit like Travancore, but it was never going to happen. There was no way that Nehru and Patel were going to permit that. But by the middle of August, most of them, apart from those three, Junagadh, Kashmir, and Hyderabad, have agreed where they are going to end up, and I say the vast majority are going to go to India. They were allowed to keep their traditional privileges then. It's only later they were removed by Indira Gandhi. And so we come to independence itself. We come to the middle of August, we come to the 14th of August and the 15th of August, the birth of India's freedom. Pakistan is created the day before India becomes independent. There is Jinnah in his new capital in Karachi. Jinnah looking old and drawn. Jinnah, of course, was very ill. Arguably, people had known how ill Jinnah was, maybe events would have taken another path. was a huge sort of theory about that. I'm actually personally not convinced. The movement, although Jinnah was absolutely the essence of the movement, it was of course broader than just him by 1947. You see in that slide, while the bored Mountbatten, distracted at the back, Mountbatten and Jinnah never ever got on, and even as late as August, they still weren't the greatest friends. So Pakistan is created on the 14th of August, east and west, west and east. And then on the 15th, India becomes independent, and you can see the difference in styles. There we have the Mountbattens in a state landau in Delhi, and Nehru perching on the back. That is all very well. We have now got to, a reckless ride in 1947. We've got the middle of 1947, and we have got partition, we've got Pakistan, we've got India, we've got a boundary. But what about the people? The last myth I just want to go into is that the violence that accompanies the partition could not have been predicted. It's not true. It could, and it was by this man. Rather like Olaf Carew, the governor of Northwest Frontier Province, is like one of the principal people who, to my mind, is one of the heroes of 47. And there were British heroes of 47 just as much as there were Indian or Pakistani. This man, Evan Jenkins, the governor of Punjab, is another. And Jenkins had been warning for a long time, way back. We read his telegrams right back until February, March, that actually partition of the Punjab would result in the most terrible bloodshed. This generation of provincial governors in India, British governors, did understand military matters. They'd all lived through the war. And Jenkins was saying that at least 4 divisions, so about 100,000 people, would be needed to police the Punjab. He acknowledged that the police force itself was useless, but he had been looking at the organisation of the Sikhs, and again, a lot of Sikhs coming out of the army had gone into organising Sikh militias. And the Sikhs were always going to want to exact revenge for that awful rape of Rawalpindi that we talked about the previous March. Even in July, he's telling Mountbatten that 4,600 people have been killed in the last few weeks alone, and 20,000 houses destroyed in Lahore. So he is seeing this level of communal violence, and his advice is that you've got to put a very large force into the Punjab to actually stop it. Why is the violence so much worse in the Punjab but not in Bengal? Well, there are 2 reasons for that. The first is that in the Punjab you've got the Sikh element. But secondly, Bengal had been partitioned before. It had been partitioned by Curzon in 1905. The boundary line that Radcliffe had chosen, that the Boundary Commission had chosen, actually follows a very similar line. And the way the communities were divided worked much more easily. There was far less actual need for migration. There would actually be a tremendous migration from East to West Bengal and vice versa. But it happened much more slowly. And also because in Bengal there was a very far-sighted general officer commanding that bit of India, a man called Francis Tuco, who's written a very good book about it, who would swamp Calcutta, which is where the violence would probably have started, with troops, and used British troops. So we'll come back to that in a moment. That didn't actually happen in the Punjab. So what we have in the Punjab between August, and it starts before August, right up until the winter, we have this terrible migration. We have the Muslims who live in that bit of a Punjab, which will stay in India, in the eastern Punjab, migrating west to get into Pakistan because they were terrified of what would happen to them if they stayed, quite rightly. And on the other hand, we have Hindus and Sikhs migrating the other way from what is now Pakistan, from West Punjab into East Punjab. And we have really probably one of the catastrophes, arguably one of the worst catastrophes of the 20th century, of the last century, is this, not only the migration itself, which involves 10 million people. But the violence that goes with it, a lot of people were packed onto trains, the trains were stopped and all the occupants butchered by militias, Muslim militias butchering Hindus and Sikhs, Sikh and Hindu militias butchering Muslims. And we end up with, figures vary, there is no absolutely accurate forecast, and some people play it down, some people play it up, but we reckon probably about 1 million people who actually killed in this terrible, terrible violence. And it's not just the physical, the death, the actual physical calamities, it's the cheapening of human life that goes with it. I mean, these are terrible scenes, but they are very common. But it's the impact, the psychological impact. So those were 1 million dead. You've now got 10 million people, a lot of whom are going to live in refugee camps, who've seen their whole lives shattered. And really, who just wonder what it's all about, if you like, have slightly given up hope. But why? Why was that army not used? Think back to the beginning of this talk. I said that actually one of the few things that actually did work in India in 1947 was the army. You had the Indian army itself, you had the British army, you had the Air Force and Navy, etc. Why? Okay, so let's just look at the Indian army. A lot of Indian armies recruited from the Punjab, therefore not very sensible to use Punjabi regiments in their local area, but that's exactly what happened. And the force that was put into the Punjab was far too small, and it was based on the 4th Division, who were in Lahore, commanded by a very able man called Rees, who had been a successful divisional commander in Burma. But he had an understrength division, about 15,000 people, to control 17,932 villages, an area the size of Ireland. And because it was based on sort of local regional regiments, it was never going to work. But why was the British army not used? 100,000, nearly a considerable number of Gurkhas Gurkhas were always acceptable to both sides. Gurkhas were seen absolutely as non-partisan. Why were they not put in as Evan Jenkins had advised and had been saying for some time with desperately? Why is the Air Force not used? There was no police force. So these forces were there. They were in India. Why? And the British forces, there was an extraordinary exchange of telegrams between London and Delhi, which said that British troops were not to be used to help save Indian life. Now to us that seems completely extraordinary, but that was from a Labour cabinet minister. And it's this sort of old idea that British troops were there to protect the British population. Well, the British population was in no danger whatsoever. Really. I mean, there were very few isolated incidents. The British troops themselves were bored stupid. That expression, going doolally, comes because of the transit camp near Bombay, near Mumbai, Deolali, where troops were just sitting waiting to be shipped home. But instead of actually using them they'd been seen as impartial and neutral and effective, they were grouped into independent brigades. They had their own logistics. It was perfectly possible to use them. And it's one, I'm afraid, of a great unanswered questions. And I'm afraid that actually both the senior army as well as the political leadership must take responsibility for it. The Congress just didn't understand armies. To them, armies were people who beat them up on demonstrations and political protests. Jinnah really had no idea what armies were. But actually, Mountbatten and Auchinleck did know an awful lot about armies. And there is something here which is missing. And of course, Francis Tucker in Bengal, who, in the best way of senior British generals, ignores instructions and does actually put Gurkhas and British troops onto the streets of Calcutta. Bengal is peaceful. It is a sad story. And then, of course, we have, if you like, the finale of the year, as the slaughter begins to ease off in the Punjab, as by November, partly due to the colder weather, partly because people of the migration is beginning to ease off. We have fighting in Jammu and Kashmir. Hari Singh had still not decided which country he was going to. His population, overridingly Muslim, wanted to go to Pakistan. He, a Hindu ruler very close to Nehru, saw his future as better served by being with India. Nehru has a very interesting relationship with Kashmir. He's actually Kashmiri by background. In Kashmir, there is something in Kashmir which Nehru thinks is sort of part of the heart and soul of India. And we end up, and again, we haven't got time in this talk to go into it, there's some excellent books about it, which I'm sure many people will have read. But through November, we have fighting between these two new countries, India and Pakistan, in Kashmir. It's not actually the Pakistani government, it is militias. And arguably, actually, the Pakistani government is not directly involved. That, again, is another whole issue. It simply probably wasn't in the state to organise them. But the local militias, local groups, if you like, had moved in and fight the Indian government. So by the end of the year, which had started with Patel's idea that partition was a temporary thing, that actually it wouldn't last, that Pakistan was a rural slum that would come back into India, that this was a temporary measure to get rid of the Brits. We have a war, a conflict, which is still going on today, and which arguably has actually allowed this deterioration in relations. So we now have two nuclear armed states. We eventually have the breakup of Pakistan and into Pakistan and Bangladesh. And we have a bitter legacy of those families who were disrupted, who were refugees, who lost so many of their family members. And arguably, it takes generations for those memories to go. Thank you for listening. The book is in paperback now, and I do hope that you will read it. And I have only been able to cover a little bit of it this morning, but I hope I've slightly whetted your appetite for something which arguably should never have happened in the way that it did. Thank you very much.